So I'm Maddie. I am a PhD candidate with the Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit as well at UniSC here. And my research is exploring the characteristics and crime processes of sexual violence against older people with consideration of how the environment shapes opportunities to offend. So as Emily suggested, sexual violence against older people is the least reported, least researched, and therefore the least understood form of sexual violence and type of elder abuse. Of the literature that we do have available, there's consensus that older adults can have higher vulnerability, with changes in physiological and cognitive functioning, often limiting capacity for self-protection. Literature also consistently recognises that victimisation impacts can be more severe for older victims, with injuries commonly including cuts, bruising, fractures, premature mortality, and of course psychological trauma as well. Older people also face considerable challenges when reporting and help seeking, such as not being believed, being dependent on their abuser for daily care needs, or where cognitive impairment might be a factor, being unable to recall or communicate specific details of the incident. So these findings clearly convey the paramount need for more proactive prevention to limit opportunities for sexual violence, reduce its prevalence, and mitigate the harms that are associated with this form of abuse. To ensure prevention efforts are informed and likely to be effective, there needs to be a robust understanding of the mechanisms driving specific crimes. So in other words, we need to understand the issue before we can actually prevent it. Relative to sexual violence against older people, there is a need for more empirical research into how these events manifest and unfold, and the situations and contexts that are enabling offending behaviour. So being event-focused, my PhD research focuses on environmental criminology perspectives to enrich understandings, which, as Emily said, is a family of theories seeking to understand how crime occurs. So to go into these theories in a little bit more depth, we have three theories under this umbrella which together examine the relationships between the environment and criminal behaviour. So first up we have the routine activity approach, which focuses on victims, establishing the role of vulnerability and guardianship in enabling crime. Next, the rational choice perspective considers offender decision-making, centred on how environmental factors can dynamically influence perceptions of risk and benefit, and ultimately shape decisions to offend. And then last, we have crime pattern theory, which explores patterns in criminal behaviour, so looking at where and when crime is most likely to occur. As these theories emphasise, situational factors can influence opportunity, both facilitating the convergence of potential victims and offenders and influencing decisions to actually engage in criminal behaviour. So one way to enhance prevention is to look beyond these individual level factors, as has been a prominent approach that we've seen in the past, to also consider the environmental conditions that are shaping this behaviour. And this is where situational crime prevention comes in, which is proactively addressing the relationships between victim, perpetrator and place. So this approach includes a catalogue of 25 different techniques that target factors within the environment to increase effort and risk, remove excuses, and reduce rewards and provocations. Now, it's obviously important to recognise here that when we're talking about provocations, we're not blaming victims at all. This is more addressing offender distortions and things like frustration and anger or peer pressure, things like those. The key takeaway here, though, as Emily pointed out, is that we can make changes to the physical environment to limit opportunity and deter potential crime. As I've established, effective prevention requires an understanding of the dynamics of sexual offences against older adults. Yet most research in this space focuses on victimisation risk factors and the challenges in the aftermath of the incident. But we really don't know much about the offence itself, which really limits the efficacy of the potential prevention efforts that we are implementing. So the overall aim of my research is therefore to explore sexual offences against older people to gain a comprehensive understanding of incident characteristics and crime processes. And this includes a focus on the situational factors which enable and advance offences to identify those opportunities for proactive prevention and early intervention throughout the crime event. So to work towards this aim, the first study within my PhD was a scoping review. And the purpose of this review was really to assess the extent to which older victim sexual violence events have been empirically examined and identify key knowledge gaps. So really importantly, I wanted to determine what is reported on the actual event itself and the circumstances surrounding offence perpetration, as well as being interested in what prevention recommendations are in literature. So after screening a bunch of studies, I had 33 that fit the criteria for the review. And notably, only 2 of those studies used Australian samples. So that really emphasises that we do need a lot more research in this area. To enrich interpretations, data was collated according to key principles of environmental criminology. So who is involved, what takes place, where and when do incidents occur, and how are they perpetrated? As I was also interested in prevention recommendations, I organised these according to the public health model, so focusing on primary and secondary approaches. So in this sense, I was looking at universal strategies to stop abuse occurring in the first place, and then strategies targeted towards high-risk people and places to intervene before harm escalates. So the scoping review found that sexual violence events against older people typically involve a female victim and a male perpetrator who is often a stranger and younger than the victim. They take place within the victim's residence during hours of darkness and comprise severe forms of violence and victimisation. Rape or penetration were the most frequently identified types of assault, with physical violence being a primary method of control, occasioning significant harm and injury to the older person. It is, however, recognised that most studies used police-reported cases of sexual violence, so these characteristics may not reflect the vast number of cases that are not reported. When recommending prevention, we see that a slight majority of studies advocated for those primary approaches, which included things like increasing awareness and guardianship and bolstering home security. Secondary prevention recommendations then mostly looked at education and training of guardians to identify abuse and stricter screening of staff in institutional settings. The review also identified several knowledge gaps. So most studies reported victim and perpetrator characteristics, as well as the involved acts and the incident outcomes. Yet much less has been revealed about when specifically these offences occur and how they are actually perpetrated. There was notable variance in the described methods and strategies that are used to perpetrate these offences, with very little information on behaviours during the preparation, initial interactions, advancement of offending, and also incident conclusion. Similarly, most prevention recommendations were people-focused, so they were focusing on awareness, education and training, and staff screening. Very few studies considered the actual abuse environment itself, with only a handful suggesting situational prevention measures. So it's therefore evident that more attention is needed to understand the crime commission process of these offences, to then enact strategies that holistically consider both the individual and the environmental conditions that are contributing to these events. So to address these gaps, I then conducted a crime script analysis of Australian court judgment texts for sexual offences against older adults, so anyone over 65 years of age. And just to give a bit of context into what a script is, so they are used to help us better understand the step-by-step processes that are involved in an event. So if you think about going to a restaurant, generally you'd follow the steps of you enter the restaurant, you wait to be seated, you have a look at the menu, you order your food, you eat your food, you then pay and you leave. And this idea around pattern behaviour obviously translates into offending as well. So if we look at the processes of how these certain crimes are committed, we're then much better placed to prevent and respond to these offences. And that's what I aim to do with this study. So to do this, I coded event variables throughout each court text to determine the most frequent patterns as well as their temporal ordering within that assault. And that allowed me to then map each stage of the sexual assault based on those patterns. So to give a bit of context to the actual sample itself, the sample obtained for analysis detailed 19 separate sexual assaults against older victims involving 17 perpetrators. The victims were overwhelmingly female and aged on average 75 years. All perpetrators were male and comparatively much younger than the victims, so they were just over 30 years of age. Notably, almost 85% of perpetrators had a prior conviction, just over half of which were for sexual offences. In terms of relationships between the parties, the victim and perpetrator were strangers in about 2/3 of cases, while 1/5 was demonstrating an acquaintance relationship. We also saw that 2 cases involved friends and 1 case was perpetrated in an intrafamilial context, so between a grandmother and a grandson who he lived with. So based on the analysis, I was able to develop this script for court-adjudicated sexual offences involving older victims. And before I talk through each of these stages, I just want to caveat that this is based on the most typical patterns identified in prosecuted cases. So not all stages will be applicable in every circumstance. I also just want to preface that all included cases were perpetrated in the community, just based on the data sample that I was able to obtain, and mostly were extrafamilial. So the script itself will not apply to every context of sexual offending against older adults. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk through each stage of this script, and I've added some quote examples as we go along as well, just to give a little bit more context to these findings. All right, so in the lead up to the offence, perpetrators would often consume alcohol or drugs, in some cases leading to quite excessive levels of intoxication. There then seemed to be this pattern of perpetrators wandering the streets at night before breaking into the victim's residence, typically via a window or an unlocked door. Across the cases, most appeared opportunistic, so there was really minimal prior planning involved. However, in just over 1/3 of cases, the victim was actually targeted, so it was either through prior knowledge of the victim or relationship with that person. Importantly, the presence of other people to act as bystanders and potentially witness or intervene in these incidents was only noted in 3 cases, and no case had an eyewitness to the actual assault itself. And I think this really highlights a significant vulnerability factor within these interactions. Once the perpetrator had entered the setting, it was then common for them to approach the victim using what we call a surprise method. So this is where the offender sneaks up on the victim or waits until they're in a vulnerable state before attacking. So in this sense, most often it was where the perpetrator would approach the victim while they were asleep. The middle stages of the event were then characterised by gaining control over the victim before sexually assaulting them. And we see in stage 4 that this most often involved a blitz attack. So this is where the perpetrator applies immediate, overpowering physical or sexual force to incapacitate the victim and deprive them of any reaction time. Following this, a portion of perpetrators then engaged in what we call forensic awareness strategies and their actions to try and avoid identification and capture. So this included things like covering the victim's face or head to obscure their vision, or closing and locking doors to avoid potential witnesses. Next, in some cases, it was necessary to use further strategies to try and gain compliance, which often included things like threats of violence and verbal demands, as well as physical force. So this then brings us to the critical stage of the event, which is the interactions and crime outcomes. So this stage involves 3 interrelated steps, which often occurred simultaneously with multiple repetitions. This stage saw victims physically and verbally resisting the attack, which often resulted in perpetrators using more violence to try and overcome that resistance, or they would just ignore that and continue with the assault. In terms of sexual outcomes, around 2/3 of incidents involved penetrative acts, with a further 6 cases involving attempted rape or penetration. Various forms of sexual touching and non-penetrative acts were also recognised in this sample. Critically though, approximately 3/4 of these incidents involved more than one sexual act, which really highlights the overall intrusiveness and severity that we're seeing in these cases. Across the entire event, almost half of all cases involved excessive levels of physical force, which led to 6 victims being hospitalised and the deaths of 2 additional victims. After these sexual assaults had taken place, a portion of perpetrators engaged in further crime, so often stealing money from the victim. 1/3 of cases also evidence attempts to actively conceal the offence, which was often threatening the victim not to disclose that abuse. Then the perpetrator would often just flee the scene voluntarily. Notably though, the sample also evidenced some interesting trends in reporting and help seeking. So obviously due to the nature of the sample, every case had to be reported at some stage, but where there was information available, we see that this often occurred within 24 hours of the assault. The other interesting thing is that a third party, so whether it be a friend, family member or neighbour, often assisted with this process, despite very few cases involving bystanders or eyewitnesses. So that provides a very brief overview of the patterns within court-adjudicated sexual assaults against older adults. But before we look into opportunities for prevention and intervention, I think it's important to discuss some of these findings in a little bit more depth and look at how environmental criminology can help us to understand these events. So the first point that I think is really worth mentioning is that despite a very comprehensive search process, only 17 court judgments involving 19 perpetrators were identified across a 25-year period. As we saw, those mostly involved perpetrators breaking into homes during the night, using really excessive violence to facilitate those penetrative sexual acts, which is very similar to what we saw in the scoping review as well. The predominance of these characteristics was actually quite surprising, though I think it says a lot about barriers to reporting and the types of cases that are successfully prosecuted. So as I said, research consistently recognises that older adults face considerable challenges in reporting abuse, particularly when perpetrated by a family member or someone known to the older person. And there's often high attrition of cases through the justice system as well, particularly due to lack of evidence and perceived credibility. So this might explain why there was such a high number of stranger perpetrated cases that use quite excessive violence. So perhaps these sort of cases might be supposedly easier for victims to report and for authorities to investigate, particularly when there's that corroborating evidence, so signs of a break-in or physical injuries that support the victim's account. In terms of environmental criminology, if we look at routine activity principles, risk can be mitigated through presence of capable guardianship. However, as I said, all victims were alone at the time of the offence. So this therefore invalidates the benefits of potential guardianship and could be seen to increase that risk. As most reported incidents occurred within the victim's home during the night, when considering the costs and the benefits of actually perpetrating an offence, the privacy provided within these settings at this particular time might appeal to a potential offender through reduced risk of detection and disruption by a guardian. And this may also explain why we saw such prevalence of those intrusive and severe sexual acts. With no one nearby to recognise potential harm and to intervene, there was more time and opportunity to facilitate and complete that sexual assault. Ultimately, though, it's evident that the way in which these events manifest and unfold is influenced by the relationships between victim, perpetrator and place. So therefore, prevention efforts similarly need to consider this interplay. So with an understanding of how these events unfold, I then mapped situational prevention strategies to each stage as suggestions for reducing opportunity and intervening in harm. Again, as these suggestions are predicated on a very small sample of quite extreme cases, I recognise that they're very exploratory and will not be appropriate for addressing all types of sexual abuse against older adults. But it is still important to recognise how we might be addressing these rare but quite severe cases as well. So in terms of prevention, we can see along the top or in the middle some of the conditions that were facilitating these instances of abuse across each stage, with then the situational prevention strategies mapped on the end. In the early stages of the event, it's clear that a lack of guardianship as well as vulnerabilities in home security were key factors that were enabling these abuse incidents. So therefore, extending guardianship and trying to bolster that home security may work to increase the effort and risks that's involved in perpetrating an offence. So we might see installation of security screens or cameras around the home to try and prevent these from occurring and discourage that offending behaviour. Likewise, pet ownership was seen as a great way to extend guardianship, or could be a great way to extend guardianship. In fact, one case within the sample, the perpetrator had tried to break into a neighbouring house, but was deterred by a barking dog. So there is that that could be an option. But we also see that beyond crime prevention, pet ownership is obviously very good for promoting well-being and successful aging and quality of life. So there's multiple benefits to that, that potential initiative there. The middle stages of the event were then similarly characterised by a lack of guardianship, with that privacy in the home facilitating quite severe and intrusive acts. Notably, when victims resisted the attack, this often meant that the perpetrator would enact further physical violence. So this indicates that perhaps we need some more discreet options for alerting others to help. So this might be things like a personal security alarm or a panic button or even a medic alert button, things like that, that may help to alert others for the need for help without promoting that extra violence that we get from those perpetrators. Additionally, a fundamental area where prevention and intervention could perhaps be strengthened is through neighbourhood level guardianship. So neighbours are really well placed to recognise unfamiliar individuals or suspicious activity within the area and perhaps take action to respond to this, whether it be calling the police or actively intervening. As I said, only 3 cases in the sample reported general observation of the offender prior to the offence, and in no case involved an eyewitness to the actual assault. Yet almost 60% of cases involved third parties assisting in reporting. So to me, this really demonstrates that social cohesion plays an important role in reporting after an event, but there might be various factors that contribute to an individual refraining from intervening earlier, whether that be concerns for their personal safety or just not knowing what to do, having inexperience in that area. So therefore, efforts to enhance community level guardianship may help to facilitate that earlier intervention in terms of understanding what to look for, what to recognise, and how to appropriately intervene in those circumstances. The end stages of the event typically depicted perpetrators stealing money before leaving voluntarily. So to alleviate further temptation, it's recommended that perhaps storing valuable items in a safe sort of hidden location might reduce that temptation, and perhaps having cameras to record footage of the offender leaving might also assist with investigations and identifying those particular suspects, also being hopefully something that might deter perpetrators in the beginning as well. Overall though, there's various situational prevention measures that can be implemented at each stage of the sexual violence event to potentially increase the effort and risks associated with perpetrating an offence, with extended guardianship and informal social control really key to protecting against extrafamilial abuse, particularly when perpetrated in the community. So where to from here? So for me, it's obvious that understanding the characteristics and the processes of these events is really crucial for directing appropriate prevention and intervention efforts. But more can be done to understand sexual violence against older people in different contexts. So I'm currently working on a policy review to determine the extent to which current elder abuse policy considers the situational dynamics of incidents, as well as how we might be able to further supplement those current approaches from an environmental criminology perspective. And then in my next study, which is a replication, I will then be using or analysing police data to compare the different dynamics of sexual offences against younger adults and older adults to hopefully gain some further insights into these offences. But overall, it's my hope that this research brings these new perspectives to how this issue can be understood and addressed to foster a more holistic approach to ensuring that older adults are adequately protected from potential harm and mistreatment. So thank you.